How does a former bus driver survive dozens of coups, a 1,000,000% hyperinflation, and the maximum pressure of a global superpower? Discover the story of Nicolás Maduro, the man who mastered the dark art of political survival amidst a nation's ruins. The narrative of Nicolás Maduro is one of the most improbable political survival stories in modern Latin American history. A transition from the driver's seat of a public bus to the ornate halls of the Miraflores Palace. To understand the man, one must first understand the shadow in which he lived, that of Hugo Chávez. When the flamboyant, larger-than-life comandante succumbed to cancer in March 2013, he didn't just leave behind a grieving nation. He left a political vacuum that seemed impossible to fill. Maduro, a former union leader and foreign minister, was the handpicked successor, anointed by Chávez in his final televised address to the nation. However, Maduro lacked the natural charisma, the military background, and the deep, almost religious connection that Chávez shared with the Venezuelan masses. He was a man of the apparatus, a loyalist who had climbed the ranks of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela PSUV through unwavering fidelity rather than personal magnetism. Upon taking the oath of office, Maduro faced the daunting task of sustaining the Bolivarian Revolution, a socialist project fueled by oil wealth and anti-imperialist rhetoric, yet the foundations were already cracking. The revolution was built on the cult of personality, and without the central figure of Chávez, the disparate factions of the military, the Chavista grassroots, and the political elite began to jostle for influence. Maduro's early days were marked by a desperate attempt to channel Chávez's spirit, even famously claiming that the late leader had appeared to him in the form of a small bird. This attempt to borrow legitimacy from a ghost highlighted his initial struggle to establish his own authority. He wasn't just inheriting a presidency. He was inheriting a movement in crisis, a social contract that was rapidly expiring, and a country that was beginning to realize that the era of easy oil money and charismatic populism was coming to a tragic end. The man who had once navigated the chaotic streets of Caracas as a driver was now at the wheel of a state heading toward a precipice, and the world watched with bated breath to see if he would steer it toward reform or cling to power at any cost. The transition of power was solidified, at least on paper, by the special election held in April 2013. But the results served only to expose the raw nerves of a fractured society. In an atmosphere thick with tension and mourning for Chávez, Maduro faced off against Enrique Capriles, a youthful governor who represented a united opposition. The campaign was brief but brutal, with Maduro framing himself as the son of Chávez, and the worker president, while Capriles argued that the country was being led to ruin by incompetent ideologues. When the National Electoral Council announced the results, the margin was shockingly thin, less than 235,000 votes, or roughly 1.5% of the total. For a movement accustomed to the double-digit landslides of the Chávez era, this was a psychological and political earthquake. The opposition immediately cried foul, citing thousands of irregularities and demanding a full manual recount of the paper receipts. Protests erupted in the streets of Caracas and other major cities, leading to clashes that resulted in multiple deaths and hundreds of injuries. Maduro's response was not one of reconciliation, but of defiance. He was quickly inaugurated amidst the chaos, accusing the opposition of being vultures and fascists backed by Washington. This moment was the death knell for any hope of national unity. It revealed a Venezuela split almost exactly down the middle, one half clinging to the promises of the revolution, and the other half feeling disenfranchised and cheated. Maduro's mandate was born in a crucible of controversy, leaving him with a permanent deficit of legitimacy in the eyes of millions. This fragility dictated his early governance. He could not afford to be moderate or to compromise, as his survival depended on the total loyalty of his base and the military. The 2013 election didn't just decide who would sit in the presidential chair. It set the stage for a decade of institutional conflict, street violence, and a government that would increasingly prioritize its own preservation over the democratic norms it claimed to uphold. We are dedicated to building a digital archive of human resilience, but these deep dives require immense resources. If you value this level of research, please like and subscribe. This tells the algorithm that deep-form history still matters in a world of fleeting content. Help us keep these legends alive. Beneath the political drama of Maduro's first year lay a ticking economic time bomb, legacy of the Chavista economic model that had finally run out of runway. For over a decade, Hugo Chávez had presided over a historic oil boom, with prices reaching heights that allowed for massive public spending. Billions of dollars were poured into Misiones social programs that provided food, healthcare, and education to the poor. While these programs initially lifted millions out of poverty and built a loyal voting bloc, they were funded by a dangerous paradox. Instead of investing oil profits into infrastructure or diversifying the economy, the government spent the windfall on consumption and imports, while simultaneously nationalizing thousands of private businesses and farms. By the time Maduro took office, the private sector had been decimated, and the country was almost entirely dependent on imports for basic survival, all paid for with oil revenue that accounted for 95%, the nation's foreign exchange. The government had essentially been living on a national credit card, backed by the assumption that oil prices would stay high forever. When Maduro assumed the presidency, the fiscal deficit was already ballooning to nearly 15% of GDP. The state-run oil giant PDVSA, should have been the nation's golden goose, had been hollowed out by corruption, lack of maintenance, and the replacement of technical experts with political loyalists. The Bolivarian Revolution had created a socialist paradise on paper, but in reality, it was a fragile facade, held together by record-high energy prices. Maduro inherited a state that was no longer producing its own food or goods, a nation that had forgotten how to function without government subsidies, and a central bank that was increasingly forced to print money to cover the gap. The stage was set for a systemic collapse, and as the global market began to shift, the man who had promised to continue the revolution found himself presiding over its structural disintegration. At the very center of this economic house of cards was the Orinoco Belt, home to the world's largest proven oil reserves. To understand Maduro's biography is to understand the tragedy of the Venezuelan oil field. Venezuela sits atop more crude oil than Saudi Arabia, yet under Maduro's tenure, these vast subterranean riches became a curse rather than a blessing. The oil fields, specifically in the Lake Maracaibo region and the Eastern Plains, were the engines of the 20th century Venezuelan miracle. But by 2013, they were falling into a state of advanced decay. Maduro, lacking the technical expertise to manage such a complex industry, relied on political appointments to run PDVSA. The oil fields became sites of profound mismanagement. Central infrastructure like pumping stations and refineries were left to rust as the government siphoned off maintenance funds to pay for political survival. In the Zulia state, once the heart of the global oil industry, the fields began to leak, coating the lake in a thick layer of crude and destroying local ecosystems. This physical collapse of the oil fields mirrored the collapse of the state itself. Maduro's inability to maintain the flow of black gold meant that even when oil prices were high, Venezuela couldn't produce enough to meet its needs. The oil was there, trapped beneath the soil, but the human capacity to extract it had been purged by a regime that valued loyalty over engineering. The oil fields, which should have provided a safety net for generations, were instead transformed into a graveyard of heavy machinery and wasted, potential serving as a silent witness to the regime's failure to transition from a petrostate to a functional modern economy. The fatal blow to Maduro's early economic stability arrived in 2014, when the global oil market experienced one of its most dramatic crashes in history. Throughout the preceding years, the price of Venezuelan crude had hovered around $100 per barrel, providing the lifeblood for the government's ambitious spending. However, a combination of the American shale boom, slowing global demand, and a strategic decision by OPEC to maintain production levels caused prices to plummet. By the end of 2014, oil had dropped below $50 a barrel, and it would continue to struggle for years. For Venezuela, this wasn't just a recession. It was an existential catastrophe. The government's revenue was effectively cut in half overnight, but its obligations remained the same. Maduro was faced with an impossible choice. He could cut social spending and risk losing his base. He could stop paying the massive foreign debts accumulated during the boom years and risk international isolation, or he could cut imports. In a move that would define the suffering of the Venezuelan people for the next decade, the government chose to prioritize debt payments to maintain its standing with creditors in China and Russia, while drastically slashing the foreign exchange available for importing food, medicine, and raw materials. This decision exposed the sheer vulnerability of a monoproduct economy. Without the petrodollars to buy what the country no longer produced, the Bolivarian dream began to evaporate. The supermarkets, once filled with subsidized goods, began to see the first signs of what would become a permanent state of shortage. Maduro attempted to blame the crisis on an economic war waged by local elites in the United States. But the reality was simpler and more devastating. The lottery ticket that had funded the revolution had finally expired, leaving behind a nation that had no backup plan and a leader who refused to acknowledge the fundamental flaws of his predecessor's design. As the flow of imports dried up, the daily life of the average Venezuelan transformed into a grueling struggle for basic survival, marking one of the most visible failures of Maduro's governance. Instead of relaxing the rigid currency and price controls that had been in place since 2003, Maduro doubled down on them, believing that state intervention could bypass the laws of supply and demand. He implemented the Fair Prices Law, sending soldiers into electronic stores and warehouses to seize goods and sell them at government-mandated prices. While this provided a temporary thrill for his supporters, it was the final nail in the coffin for the country's supply chain. Businesses, unable to get dollars at the official rate to restock their shelves and facing the threat of arrest if they raised prices to cover their costs, simply stopped operating. The result was a national nightmare of scarcity. Iconic images began to emerge from the country. Thousands of people standing in lines for 10, 12, or even 20 hours just to buy a single bag of flour or a roll of toilet paper. These lines, known as colas, became a central feature of Venezuelan society. Basic staples like milk, sugar, cooking oil, and even soap became luxuries. This vacuum birthed a new underground economy led by the Baqueros resellers who would wait in lines for hours to buy price-controlled goods, and then flip them on the black market for 10 or 20 times the original cost. The government's attempt to control the crisis through the clap. Boxes, packages of subsidized food distributed through local communal councils only added to the misery. As the system was plagued by corruption and used as a tool of political control, if you didn't support the party, your box might never arrive. In the richest oil-producing nation in South America, mothers were forced to search for medicine in garbage bins or swap jewelry for a bottle of antibiotics. Maduro's refusal to pivot away from a broken system turned a fiscal crisis into a full-blown humanitarian disaster, where the simple act of baking bread or finding an aspirin became a revolutionary feat. By 2016, the Venezuelan economy had entered the terrifying territory of hyperinflation, a phenomenon that effectively erased the value of labor and the concept of savings for an entire population. As the government continued to print massive amounts of the national currency, the Bolivar, to cover its ever-widening budget deficit, the money became little more than colored paper. At its peak in 2018, inflation reached a staggering, incomprehensible rate of over 1,000,000%. The speed of the collapse was so rapid that prices in stores would change multiple times a day. A worker's monthly salary might be enough to buy a dozen eggs at the start of the week and only a single cup of coffee by the end of it. The psychological toll was immense. Citizens were forced to carry backpacks full of cash just to pay for a simple meal. And in many places, shopkeepers stopped counting bills and started weighing them on scales instead. The government attempted to solve the problem with cosmetic changes, launching new redenominated versions of the currency, the Bolivar Soberano, and later the Bolivar Digital, by lopping off 5 and then 6 zeros from the denominations. But these were mere band-aids on a severed artery. People began to abandon the Bolivar entirely, resorting to bartering, trading car parts for food or haircuts for medicine. In the border regions, the Colombian peso or the US dollar became the only recognized forms of payment. The middle class was decimated overnight. Professors, doctors, and engineers found themselves earning the equivalent of $5 a month, Unable to afford even the most basic calories, Maduro's administration remained in a state of denial, blaming speculators and imperialist hackers for the currency's death, even as the central bank stopped publishing economic data to hide the extent of the ruin. The death of the Bolivar was more than an economic statistic. It was the destruction of the social fabric, making it impossible for families to plan for the future and forcing an entire nation to live in a perpetual, frantic present. The pressure of economic collapse inevitably boiled over into the political sphere, leading to the darkest and most violent period of Maduro's reign. In early 2017, after the government-aligned Supreme Court attempted to strip the opposition-led National Assembly of its legislative powers, a move widely condemned as a self-coup, the country exploded in rage. For 4 consecutive months, hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans took to the streets in near-daily protests. The scenes were apocalyptic. Young shield-bearers using homemade wooden barriers to face off against armored vehicles. Clouds of tear gas blanketing entire neighborhoods, and the constant crackle of rubber bullets and live ammunition. Maduro's response was a brutal plan, Zamora, a military and civilian coordination aimed at crushing the dissent. Security forces, particularly the National Guard and the feared SEBIN intelligence service, were accused by international human rights organizations of systematic torture, arbitrary arrests, and extrajudicial killings. Perhaps more terrifying were the colectivos armed, pro-government paramilitary groups on motorcycles who acted as the regime's enforcers, roaming the streets and firing into crowds with impunity. By the end of the summer, over 120 people had been killed, thousands were injured, and many more were thrown into military prisons. The world watched in horror as Maduro moved from a hybrid leader to a full-blown autocrat, willing to turn the state's weapons against its own people to ensure his survival. The 2017 protests represented a point of no return. The Bolivarian government had shed any pretense of popular consensus, relying instead on raw, organized violence to maintain control. The fear instilled during these months broke the back of the mass street movement for a time, but it also cemented Maduro's reputation as a leader who would rather see his country burn than relinquish the presidential sash. In the wake of the 2017 bloodshed, Maduro sought to institutionalize his grip on power through a controversial legal maneuver that bypassed the will of the voters. Since the opposition had won a landslide victory in the 2015 legislative elections, the National Assembly had been a thorn in the side of the executive branch. To neutralize this threat, Maduro bypassed the existing constitution and called for the election of a National Constituent Assembly (ANC) in July 2017. This new body was ostensibly designed to rewrite the constitution, but its true purpose was immediately clear. It was a super legislature composed entirely of Maduro loyalists, including his own wife and son. The election for the ANC was widely denounced as fraudulent. Even the company that provided the voting machines, Smartmatic, stated that the turnout figures had been manipulated by at least 1 million votes. Despite the international outcry and the domestic protests, the ANC was inaugurated and immediately began to act as a parallel government. It granted itself the power to pass laws, remove officials, including the defiant Attorney General Luisa Ortega Diaz, and rubber stamp every decree issued by Maduro. The legitimate, elected National Assembly was left powerless, its building occasionally stormed by pro-government mobs and its members harassed or forced into exile. This move effectively ended the separation of powers in Venezuela. Maduro had succeeded in creating a tailor-made parliament that gave a veneer of legality to his increasingly dictatorial rule. The ANC never actually produced a new constitution, proving that its existence was purely a tactical weapon used to dismantle the last remaining democratic institution in the country. By consolidating all branches of government under his singular influence, Maduro completed the transition from a contested presidency to an absolute executive, leaving no legal or institutional avenue for his opponents to challenge his authority. While the vast majority of the Venezuelan population descended into poverty, a new shadowy elite emerged, thriving in the chaos of the Maduro regime. This group, it's often referred to as the Boligarchy or Bolibourgeoisie, consisted of high-ranking military officers, government officials, and well-connected businessmen who grew fabulously wealthy through corruption and state patronage. The primary engine of this wealth was the country's complex system of multiple exchange rates. For years, those with connections to the government could obtain US dollars at a highly subsidized official rate. and then immediately sell them on the black market for hundreds of times the price, pocketing billions in arbitrage profits. This was, in effect, the greatest heist of national wealth in the history of the continent. While hospitals lacked basic supplies like gauze and clean water, the oligarchs lived in fortified mansions in the Las Mercedes district of Caracas, frequented luxury restaurants where bills were paid in stacks of greenbacks, and sent their children to expensive schools in Europe and the United States. Corruption also hollowed out the state oil company PDVSA, which became a slush fund for the regime. Billions of dollars were siphoned off through shell companies and fraudulent contracts, much of it laundered through banks in Florida, Switzerland, and Andorra. One of the most notorious figures in this web was Alex Saab, a Colombian businessman who became Maduro's primary fixer, allegedly laundering money through the very food programs CLAP meant to feed the hungry. The contrast was staggering. A socialist government that preached equality and the power of the people was presiding over a system of extreme inequality where a small circle of loyalists feasted on the carcass of the state while the masses starved. This entrenched corruption became Maduro's greatest insurance policy. By allowing the military and his inner circle to enrich themselves, he ensured that their survival was inextricably tied to his own. The most heart-wrenching consequence of the Maduro era is not found in economic charts or political decrees, but in the millions of footsteps of those who chose to leave everything behind. As hunger became a daily reality and the hope for political change flickered out, Venezuela experienced the largest displacement of people in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Over 7.7 million Venezuelans, more than 25% of the total population, have fled the country since Maduro took office. This was not a migration of choice, but a desperate flight for survival. This exodus, often referred to as the caminantes or the walkers, saw families, including children and the elderly, trekking thousands of miles across the South American continent. They crossed the treacherous Darien Gap on foot, navigated the high freezing passes of the Andes, and spilled into neighboring Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Chile. The images of these caravans of people carrying their lives in tattered backpacks became a symbol of a collapsed state. The brain drain was catastrophic. Venezuela lost its doctors, its teachers, its engineers, and its youth, leaving behind a hollowed-out nation of the elderly and the very poor. Those who stayed often survived only because of the remittances sent back by those who had left ironically. Very people the regime had branded as traitors became the primary support system for the domestic economy. This migration crisis didn't just affect Venezuela, it strained the social services and political stability of the entire region. Yet for Maduro, the exodus served as a convenient safety valve. By forcing the most vocal and desperate of his critics to leave, he reduced the immediate pressure on domestic resources and weakened the opposition's base. The tragedy of the caminantes remains a permanent scar on the nation's history, a testament to a government that made its own country unlivable for a significant portion of its citizens. The geopolitical landscape for Maduro shifted dramatically in 2019 when the United States, under the Trump administration, adopted a maximum pressure campaign designed to topple the regime. Following a widely discredited presidential election in 2018, which the opposition boycotted and much of the international community refused to recognize, the U.S. and over 50 other countries recognized the head of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, as the legitimate interim president. This was accompanied by a series of crippling sanctions that targeted the very heart of the government's finances. The U.S. imposed a virtual embargo on Venezuelan oil, preventing PDVSA from selling crude to its most lucrative market, American refineries. Sanctions were also placed on the central bank, the gold industry, and dozens of high-ranking officials, effectively cutting off the regime from the global financial system. The goal was to starve the government of cash and trigger a military defection that would lead to a democratic transition. However, the results were more complicated. While the sanctions undoubtedly accelerated the economic collapse and made it nearly impossible for the government to function, they also provided Maduro with a powerful propaganda tool. He blamed every failure, every power outage, and every empty shelf on the imperialist blockade, shifting the focus away from years of mismanagement. Moreover, the sanctions didn't lead to a military coup. Instead, they forced Maduro to become even more reliant on dark trade networks and shadow allies. The regime began selling oil through a ghost fleet of tankers with their transponders turned off and laundering money through illegal mining operations in the Amazon. For the average Venezuelan, the sanctions were a double-edged sword. They weakened the dictator. But they also made the daily struggle for food and medicine even more agonizing as the economy ground to a total halt. Faced with isolation from the West, Nicolás Maduro skillfully turned Venezuela into a critical outpost for America's global rivals, ensuring his survival through a web of strategic alliances. As Washington tightened the noose, Maduro looked to Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran for a lifeline. Russia became the regime's most vital military and financial backer, providing advanced weapons systems, fighter jets, and even private security contractors from the Wagner Group to bolster the Venezuelan military. In exchange, Russia gained a strategic foothold in the U.S.'s backyard and control over significant portions of Venezuela's oil reserves. China, meanwhile, acted as the country's primary creditor, having loaned over $60 billion in exchange for guaranteed oil shipments. While Beijing eventually slowed its lending as the crisis deepened, it continued to provide diplomatic cover at the United Nations and technical support for the regime's digital surveillance systems, including the fatherland card used for social control. Perhaps the most intriguing alliance was with Iran, united by their shared status as pariah states under U.S. sanctions. Tehran sent tankers of gasoline to alleviate Venezuela's fuel shortages and technicians to help repair its decaying refineries. These relationships turned Venezuela into a chessboard for modern geopolitical rivalry. Maduro was no longer just a local leader. He was a key player in a global struggle against Western hegemony. By selling the country's mineral wealth and its very sovereignty to these foreign powers, Maduro secured the loans, the fuel, and the military protection necessary to withstand the maximum pressure campaign. This axis of survival proved that, in a multipolar world, even a bankrupt and isolated regime can stay in power if it is willing to barter its soul to the enemies of its enemies. The year 2024 emerged as a new and critical chapter in the struggle for Venezuela's future. As the Maduro regime faced a resurgent and unified opposition, despite years of repression and the fragmentation of his rivals, a new figure emerged to galvanize the country: Maria Corina Machado. A staunch critic of the regime who had long refused to compromise, Machado won a landslide victory in the opposition's primary election, capturing the hopes of millions who were exhausted by years of crisis. Maduro's response followed a familiar authoritarian script. The government-controlled courts quickly moved to disqualify Machado from holding public office for 15 years, citing vague and unsubstantiated allegations. This move directly violated the Barbados Agreement, a deal brokered with the help of the United States that promised a path toward free and fair elections in exchange for some sanctions relief. As the election date approached, the regime intensified its crackdown, arresting Machado's campaign staff and blocking her chosen substitute, Corina Yoris, from even registering on the electoral website. The message from Miraflores was clear. Maduro was willing to hold an election, but only one that he was guaranteed to win. The 2024 cycle demonstrated that, despite the internal dollarization and the superficial stabilization of the economy, the regime's fundamental priority remained unchanged: survival above all else. Dove. The disqualification of Machado showed a government that was terrified of a truly competitive vote, preferring to risk further international sanctions and isolation rather than face the judgment of a population that had seen its quality of life destroyed under its watch. The geopolitical tension reached a fever pitch as the world watched to see if the regime would finally be forced to blink, or if it would successfully engineer another sham victory to extend its reign into a second decade. In one of the most ironic twists of his presidency, Nicolás Maduro, the man who once vowed to destroy the capitalist demon, only managed to stay in power by allowing the total, unofficial dollarization of the Venezuelan economy. By 2019, with hyperinflation out of control and the Bolívar dead, Maduro quietly abandoned the socialist orthodoxy he had inherited, stopped enforcing price controls, allowed private businesses to import goods without government interference, and looked the other way as the US dollar became the primary currency for all transactions. This move, which he famously described as a safety valve for the country, succeeded in ending the chronic shortages. Suddenly, the shelves of Bodegon's luxury import stores were filled with Hershey's bars, Italian wines, and American detergents. But this stability came at a brutal social cost. It created a two-tier society where those with access to dollars, those working for foreign companies, receiving remittances, or connected to the oligarchy, could live a comfortable, even lavish life. Meanwhile, the millions who still earned in bolivars, including retirees and public sector workers, were left in a state of destitute poverty, unable to afford even a fraction of the goods now available. The socialist dream had been replaced by a raw, unregulated version of capitalism where the state provided nothing and only those with hard currency could survive. Caracas transformed into a city of sparkling new casinos and skyscrapers, while the rural interior of the country continued to suffer from frequent blackouts and a lack of running water. Maduro had surrendered his ideology to save his throne, presiding over a nation where the dollar was king and the working-class revolution was a distant, bitter memory. The legacy of Nicolás Maduro is that of a man who successfully navigated a ship of state into a hurricane, watched it splinter into 1,000 pieces, and yet somehow remained standing. On the bridge, as the captain of the wreckage, under his decade-long reign, Venezuela's economy shrank by a staggering 75%, a collapse more severe than that of most nations during wartime. He presided over the destruction of the national currency, the birth of a humanitarian crisis that displaced millions, and the dismantling of the country's democratic institutions. Yet, Maduro proved to be a master of the dark arts of political survival. He outmaneuvered a dozen coup attempts, survived an apparent drone assassination, withstood the maximum pressure of the world's greatest superpower, and successfully split his opposition time and again. He did this by hollowing out the state from the inside, replacing civil servants with soldiers and judges with loyalists, till the government became nothing more than a mechanism for its own reproduction. He remains in the Miraflores Palace not because of popular support, which has long since evaporated, but because he successfully bound the interests of the military and a corrupt elite to his own survival. As Venezuela looks toward an uncertain future, the challenge for the next generation will not just be replacing a president, but rebuilding a state that has been fundamentally broken. Maduro's story is a cautionary tale of how populist promises can pave the way for an autocracy that consumes its own children, leaving behind a nation that is a shadow of its former self, waiting for the day when it can finally move out from the long dark shadow cast by the driver who refused to stop even as the road disappeared beneath him.